Welcome in to episode 12 of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we've got a fantastic one in store for you. It's Final Four week, and Alabama is going to Phoenix. I'm going to break down how they got there. As I mentioned in the last episode, I was in LA for the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games against North Carolina and Clemson, so I'm going to talk a little bit about those. And then we're going to go into this UConn game that's going to be happening in Phoenix on Saturday. As I mentioned, I am going to be in Phoenix. A little bit of a programming note. I am planning to try to take my microphone and laptop with me to Phoenix. If Alabama loses, there is a chance that I'm not going to break down the game on Sunday. However, if Alabama wins, I will try to put out a little bit of a shorter episode on Sunday that is breaking down the UConn game, what went right, and what we need to see for the Final Four championship game that's going to be happening on Monday. So just as a heads up, there is a chance that there is going to be another episode coming out this week. It will depend on how the games go, how people are doing, what all I get into out in Phoenix. I will be out in Phoenix, so anybody that is going out there as well, shoot me a message on Twitter. Reach out to me on here. I'm happy to connect with people, while out in Phoenix cheering on the Tide for its first ever Final Four. So let's get into the games that happened in LA this past weekend, and then we'll break down the UConn game in Phoenix. So let's start with the North Carolina game. I talked a lot about this Carolina game in the last episode and what I thought that Alabama needed to do and who I thought Alabama needed to see big games out of. My biggest person that I needed to see a big game out of was Grant Nelson. We were going against Armando Bacot, and I thought that Grant Nelson was going to have to play one of his best games to be able to obviously stop Bacot, and obviously we were also going to need some good defense out of Estrada and Sears on RJ Davis, or, Rylan Griffin or whoever was going to be playing on RJ Davis. We were going to need good defense out of them as well because North Carolina had some guys that could score. And really importantly, don't lay too much off of Cormac Ryan because Cormac Ryan, as we know, in that Notre Dame game had dominated us, a couple of years ago. So the game went about how I expected, quite frankly. Alabama played its game. They did get behind pretty early to Carolina, and then they fought their way back. And what we saw was Alabama was able to run the game plan that we thought they were going to run. Alabama was hitting some shots, and Alabama was, doing well. And North Carolina was getting some really big threes out of Cormac Ryan, and it was pretty clear what Alabama's game plan was. Elliot Kudo and Seth Trimble, the two guards for Carolina that are not three-point threats, Nate was basically going to dare them to shoot the ball. In the first half, they actually did. They made 3 threes because Alabama was not guarding them on the three-point line, and we were packing it in down tight, playing Nick Pringle with Armando Bacot, having Grant Nelson be the defender on Kudo and Trimble, so that you could double team Bacot down low or have a help defender with Grant. It was working great. However, Kudo and Trimble made us pay a couple of times and hit a couple of big threes. Nate actually talked post-game about they looked at the analytics and said, do we need to change it up, right? The analytics said coming into this game, sag off Kudo, sag off of Trimble. Do we keep that up? They decided to stay with it, and in the second half, Trimble and Kudo don't hit the same shots. They actually don't end up playing a ton in the second half, and the defensive game plan that Nate had seemed to be working pretty well. Rylan Griffin had been on RJ Davis in the first half, and then we come to find out later on that Rylan Griffin wanted the Cormac Ryan matchup after Cormac hit a couple of big shots because Rylan was not letting a shooter go off like that. He was like, give me the matchup. I don't care what it takes. He's mine. Figure it out. And, Nate talks to Preston Murphy, who's going through the scouts, says, hey, figure it out. Get Rylan on him. He wants him. So Ryland ends up shutting down Cormac Ryan, and it really sets up for a pretty big game down the stretch. There cannot be enough said for how huge Grant Nelson was in this game. I have the stats in front of me. So he goes 24, 8, and 5 blocks. 24, 12, and 5. 12 rebounds, 4 of them being offensive, 5 huge blocks, including a very, very big one on RJ Davis as he was going to tie the game at the very end of the game. He ends up hitting some very big free throws. He ends up missing one of the last free throws of the game. And then I'm not actually sure if he missed the last one on purpose because there was 0.6 seconds left in the game. He misses the last one on purpose, or I think potentially on purpose, gets the block to seal the win, and Alabama wins its first Elite Eight game since 2004. Sweet 16 game since 2004, and sets up what's going to be one of the biggest games in Alabama history if they're able to pull it off, right? Alabama's never made the Final Four. They had just one Elite Eight prior. They got steamrolled by UConn back in 2004. And Alabama is in a position where they're potentially going to make it. The matchup for that game is Clemson. Clemson is coming off of a win against Arizona where Arizona did not shoot very well. The funny part about that is coming into that game, a lot of people wanted to see Caleb Love match up with his old team at North Carolina. Both teams ended up not making that next round. Caleb Love shot 0 for 9 from 3. RJ Davis shot 0 for 9 from 3. There was some good defense on this, but I will say both of those guys just did not play the games that you were kind of accustomed to seeing from them this season. But you absolutely just have to talk about how great that Alabama played in that game. Aaron Estrada, 8 for 13 from 2. Like I said, Grant Nelson goes 2 for 2 from 3 as well. Ryland Griffin, 5 for 8 from 3. In that first half, when Alabama was having some shots hit against them by Cormac Ryan and Kudo, Ryland was huge to answer the call and make some big threes of his own. So the other thing that happened in that game that we'll talk a little bit about coming into this UConn game, and it was a little bit of an issue in the Elite Eight game, was Nick Pringle ends up hurting his foot. There was some comments coming into the Sweet 16 that Nick Pringle had been battling a heel injury and a foot injury, and he goes down in that game. There's some questions as to, is it Achilles, is it a heel, what's going on? We come to find out it's a heel injury. He's not able to finish out the game against UNC. However, in the post game, he was asked, hey, you going to be able to go for Clemson? And he basically replied, it's the Elite Eight. I don't care. Like, if I have a leg, I'm playing. And, props to Clark, the trainer. He did everything he could. He got Nick back into position to be able to play in that Elite Eight game. And we'll talk about the game that he had against Clemson. But he was absolutely incredible, right? So just want to talk about kind of those massive performances. Obviously, Mark Sears, awesome as always. He ends up having 18 points. But kind of the big thing to talk about in this game was also Mark Sears is your leading scorer on the season, and he's kind of your go-to guy, especially in late game situations. And Nate goes to Mark at the end of the game and says, hey, what play do you want me to run to get you open? And Mark says, don't go to me. Let's go to Grant. He's on fire right now. He's got everything going. Let's run a play for Grant. And it really just shows when you have your leading scorer that's not worried, about it and is going to try to ride the hot hand and trust in his teammates. Nate and the team have talked about the Mudita that Patrick Murphy, the softball coach, kind of talked to them about. This was as perfect of an example as that as you get. Sears ends up passing up the opportunity for the play. They run something for Grant. Grant ends up scoring on that play, hits a big 3 at the end of the game to put us up 5, hits some big free throws at the end of the game, and Alabama ends up winning that game 89-87. As I mentioned, the game went about exactly as I expected. My original prediction that I had put out on the write-up and the thread was 87-92. So, if Grant hits those last two free throws, it would have been 87-91. In my mind, this was the game plan that Alabama needed to be able to win this game, and they executed it absolutely to perfection. So, as I mentioned, this set up an Elite Eight game against Clemson. And that Elite Eight games against Clemson was going to be the biggest game in program history for one of the two teams. Both Alabama and Clemson, neither one has ever made a Final Four. So whoever wins that game makes their first ever Final Four. And if we talk about Grant Nelson being the most important guy, that you have to circle, obviously Ryland did great, but Grant, kind of stole the show against North Carolina. And we talked about how Mo Diabate really won the game for us against Grand Canyon. If you're going to talk about those guys, the guy who you have to circle outside of Mark Sears for this Clemson game has to be Jaron Stevenson. Much was talked about Jaron Stevenson in that Carolina game and the fact that he grew up outside of Chapel Hill. His mother played for Carolina. He grew up a Tar Heels fan. And it was going to be super emotional for him. And even though he didn't end up really scoring much in that Carolina game, he ends up actually not scoring at all. But Nate mentions that he leads the team in plus minus. He does end up getting 4 rebounds, an assist, a block. So he has an okay game in the 15 minutes he does get, but he doesn't end up scoring. So, that doesn't really surprise me. Obviously, he had a lot of pressure on himself, and I'm sure he had thought of that moment over and over and over again playing against Carolina. So that one didn't really surprise me. But in this Clemson game, we got the best version of Jaron Stevenson and what was his best game of his Alabama career thus far. Jaron ends up got the stat here, he ends up getting 19 points. He goes 2 of 3 from 2, 5 of 8 from 3, gets 3 rebounds and 2 blocks, and only one foul in 25 minutes of action, right? So Jaron Stevenson, played absolutely to perfection. In the first half, the first shot he ends up putting up was an air ball. And I actually was sitting in the stadium closest to where that was, and you could tell it just felt like he kind of rushed it a little bit. But, it's like, hey, I hope this doesn't hurt his confidence. He had an open look. We thought that Clemson might give some open looks. Arizona had open looks and just had missed the shots. Clemson, for whatever, to their credit, their defense had not been super great at staying on shooters, but teams had not had great shooting luck against them thus far in the tournament. So Alabama opens the game pretty poorly from 3. And then Jaron Stevenson hits a big 3 when Alabama's down 13. And you can start to see that Alabama is starting to play a little bit more like we're used to seeing, right? In that game, Alabama gets down 13, but, I was texting with people during the game, and it never really felt like Clemson was just running away with the game. Alabama was crushing them on the offensive boards, and we were just missing some layups. We were missing some open shots. And not just open threes, but open layups or, pretty easy layups. And I actually heard in the press conference that Nate did, that he did after the game, that the analytics company that they use, I'm pretty sure it was HD Intelligence, but the analytics company that they had with them said that based on the stats of how the first half was played, they were analytically up like 11 points. The scoreboard said just 3, but that number of 11 that the analytics company said, in my mind made a lot of sense because Alabama felt like in complete control of the game. They were rebounding well. They were playing well on defense. They just were missing some shots. In the first half, the beginning of that game, it felt like Alabama came out pretty tight. It felt like Alabama was just rushing some shots and maybe was putting a little bit of pressure on themselves, knowing that this game was to go to the Final Four. We also saw some pretty weak fouls that went against Grant Nelson. A couple of them absolutely were fouls. A couple of them were a little questionable for how physical the game was being down low with P.J. Hall and Nick Pringle and Grant. It just, a couple of them were a little weak in my opinion because of how physical they were allowing the game to get. But nevertheless, Grant Nelson picks up 2 fouls super early. And it seems like, hey, Alabama's playing really well, but if they lose Grant Nelson, Nick Pringle is going to have to step up. And as I mentioned just prior, he had a little bit of a sore foot. So we're not sure if that's going to come back to bite us. So obviously getting this game out of Jaron Stevenson is absolutely massive. Then as we get closer to half, Mark Sears starts making some shots. Riley Griffin makes a couple of shots. And everything just starts to turn in the position of, hey, Alabama's doing well in this game, and if they'll keep it up, they're going to go to the Final Four. And as a fan, it's hard to trust what you're seeing, because if you followed this basketball team for any number of years, there's been and it's been written, when good things happen, bad things are sure to follow. And it's kind of a situation where anytime you see we're doing well, you're kind of worried for the bag-breaking turnover that's going to cost the game, or the terrible shot selection, or whatever it is that's going to end up costing them the game. You didn't really see it in this game. Alabama stuck to its guns, they stuck to their game plan, and they played what got them here. Alabama continues to get open shots from 3. After the really poor start to start the game, Alabama ends up shooting really, really well to end the game. They finish 16 of 36 from deep. Mark Sears, huge piece of that. I believe he went 0 of 7 to start and then was perfect to end, or 0 of 6, and then but he hit 7 in a row. Just massive shots from Mark Sears. One of them was a logo 3. In the defender. Defender doesn't step out. He takes it from the logo, nothing but net. Mark Sears really took over the game later on in the game as well. Obviously don't want to undercredit how well he played in this game, but getting the game that you got out of Jaron Stevenson was absolutely huge. The other guy you have to talk about when you talk about this Clemson game was Nick Pringle. In a game where Grant Nelson got into some foul trouble, Grant Nelson only ends up scoring 8 points. He does have 7 rebounds, but he has 4 turnovers and 4 fouls. Nick Pringle played one of the best games he's ever played, given the circumstances especially. He played 32 minutes. He gets 16 points, 11 rebounds, 5 assists, a block and a steal. And he goes 8 of 13 from the line. Much has been talked about Nick Pringle from the line. And I talked to the people around me, everybody was like, oh my gosh, Nick's at the line. The thing with Nick at the line is when he is in rhythm, he can make them. He has the form, even with the one-handed. When he gets it down, he can make shots. If you watch him in pregame warm-ups, if you watch him in halftime warm-ups, he can make shots. He'll make 10 in a row all the time. Sometimes he rushes it a little much or puts a little extra on it, as anybody might. And usually when he misses, he's missing a little deep and he's hitting it off the back iron. He ends up shooting pretty well in this game, and Alabama absolutely needed those free throws because what was happening is, Alabama was answering a 3 for 3, and then there was a moment where Clemson gets a 3, and we go to Nick down low. He gets an and one, finishes the and one for a 3-point play, right? So Alabama seemed to be taking every punch that Clemson threw at them, and it was perfect, right? The point when I personally knew, hey, this has a great chance of Alabama winning this game, is there was a sequence at around the 7-minute mark in this game Joe Girard hits a three to cut the game to a 3-point game. Alabama, in like 5 seconds, pushes it down the court. Rylan Griffin hits a three in the corner. The next possession, Joe Girard hits hits a contested three. Alabama gets a three that possession for Jaron Stevenson to hit a three. So Alabama's keeping it at that 6 point. Clemson cuts it to 3. Alabama gets it to 6. Clemson cuts it to 3. Alabama gets it to 6. And obviously, when this is happening, the pace is starting to rise a little bit. Alabama obviously wants to get that pace up. Then Ian Shefflin, the forward for Clemson, that's really not as much of a shooter, but absolutely can make shots, ends up missing a three, to which Alabama follows it up with a Mark Sears make, which stretches that lead to 9. Clemson has to take a timeout, and at that moment, it was pretty clear in my mind that Alabama had a great shot of winning this game because they were making Clemson play their game, not Clemson's game, right? Clemson's game is going into the post, playing through P.J. Hall, playing through Ian Shefflin. Their game is not running and gunning from threes and pushing it in transition. That's Alabama's game. So as soon as Clemson felt like, hey, we got to have Girard hit a three, got to have Girard hit a three, got to have Girard hit a three. And he did. Girard made 5 of 10 from deep. He was by far the best shooter they had on the court. But when the game turned into a 3-point shooting contest, I'm going to take Alabama every time. Joe Girard has hit a lot of threes this season. I'm still going to take Alabama because Alabama has shooters on the court at every moment, and Alabama wins the game and makes its first ever Final Four. They win the game by 7 and make their first Final Four. So a player I have not talked about so far is Latrell Wrightsell. And I didn't talk about him thus far because he didn't play in either of these two games. In the Grand Canyon game, he leaves with what is an apparent concussion. Some people I know, close to the team say that it's a head injury. Not exactly sure if it's fully a concussion, whiplash, but it is definitely a head injury of some sort. And Nate mentions we're not going to risk a player's long-term health for a potential single game. So Latrell does not play in the North Carolina game, and he does not play in the Clemson game. Coming into this tournament, Alabama had lost and not played well in a few games that they were missing Latrell Wrightsell. Partially due to lack of defense and lack of effort on defense, partially due to tired legs, and partially due to the offense just was not performing and was not shooting as well. That can happen if you're missing your best shooter. Latrell Wrightsell statistically is our best shooter. So coming into these games, it was pretty obvious why a lot of people were on Carolina to win the game, or may have been on Clemson, especially after Clemson won in Coleman Coliseum to win the game, with Alabama being shorthanded without Latrell Wrightsell. However, all of this being said, we have some news for this coming week for the Final Four. As of recording today, Tuesday, April the 2nd, Latrell Wrightsell played in practice today. He did not practice on Monday, but he did practice today before the team boarded their flight, and they are now in Phoenix. Per Nate Oates on the Hey Coach radio show, and again today, as long as Latrell keeps progressing along and does not have any setbacks, they do expect for him to be able to play in Saturday's game in the Elite Eight. In the Final Four against UConn. That is huge news. Obviously, it adds another shooter, it adds another ball handler, it adds another defender, and against a UConn team that has been absolutely elite this entire season, having all of your shooters available and ready is massive. So I will mention that. I will say I did in the airport, I don't know if anybody follows me on Twitter, but I did actually put out a tweet that I actually sat across from Latrell's parents in the LA airport the morning after the Elite Eight game on the way home. They were headed back to Omaha. I was headed obviously back to the Birmingham area. I live here in Tuscaloosa. But we were on a flight headed to Denver. That was where both of our layovers were. and I had a good talk with them. Awesome, awesome people. Really, really nice. Really proud of him and obviously them. And, I think that having him back in this game will be huge. You can definitely tell that he, wanted to be out there with his guys. But I do understand why the training staff and the doctors did not have him play in this game. But if we can have him for that UConn game, that gives you an additional player to be able to shoot some threes, guard on the perimeter, and hopefully be able to win that UConn game. So let's get into the UConn game and how their team stacks up, what we need to know, and what my personal thoughts are on how we can potentially pull what will be a massive upset, at least in terms of what Vegas thinks. Everybody in Vegas, there was like 80+% of the money that was on Carolina when Alabama ends up beating North Carolina. Nate Oates had used that in fuel against, or to tell the players, like, hey, nobody believes in you. He's also used the fact that everyone talks poorly on the defense as a, hey, nobody believes in you. Thus far, it's worked. The defense has looked much better. The team has played with a chip on their shoulder. We will see what ends up happening in this UConn game. So, for the UConn game, I have their stats pulled up. First things first, UConn is number one in the country per KenPom. They were the number one overall seed coming into this tournament, and they are on an 11-game winning streak. If you go back to last year's tournament, they have only trailed in the second half in NCAA tournament games for about 35 seconds. They are a very, very good team. There's no other way to put it. They are a very good team. However, I do think Alabama can win the game if they stick to their game plan and execute and make shots. I do not think this UConn team is unbeatable. However, I do think that Alabama is going to have to play one of its best games to be able to beat them. A B- game will not beat UConn. You're going to have your A game. So when you're looking at where UConn is elite versus where they're maybe not quite as good, UConn is number one in the country currently on offense. They are number 4 in the country on defense. They are second in 2-point percentage on defense, third in effective field goal percentage. They're 13th in offensive rebounding. They're 4th in the country in 2-point offense. They're 15th in blocks. When you look at their KenPom page, it's all green. Everything is positive for how UConn plays. When you think about UConn, though, it really starts with Donovan Clingan in the center. Donovan Clingan's the 7'2", 280 pounds. He's a sophomore. Last year was a freshman. He is a shot blocking machine, and he is a super efficient scorer down low. Per KenPom, he's 65% on the season from 2. The one place where he's not elite is free throws. He's only about 57% on the season, so that is something kind of to keep an eye on. But he blocks everything and plays just really, really good defense without fouling. He draws a decent number of fouls a game, near top 100 in the country, and does a great job on the boards. 27th in offensive rebound rate, 74th in defensive rebound rate. He is a very good player, and he will be a key to what UConn tries to do in the center of the court. However, Alabama has played multiple big guys this season that are elite at rebounding and that are elite at shot blocking. They have played Zach Edey. They have played Ryan Kalkbrenner. They have played Armando Bacot. They played Janai Broome. They've played, they've played Ballo from Arizona. They've played PJ Hall at Clemson. They have played all of these elite shot blockers and rim protectors and elite big men, with Kalkbrenner and Edey both being over 7 foot, so, more on the Clingan side. So they have experience playing against players of this stature and that are going to play drop coverage in this way. more similar to how Ryan Kalkbrenner plays. When you look at like the common players based on stats, Ryan Kalkbrenner is one that pops up a lot. Another one that also pops up for how he likes to play is actually DeAndre Ayton, that Nate Oates' Buffalo team took down when DeAndre Ayton was at Arizona. So Nate Oates and this season's team also has a lot of experience with playing against guys that are this good. They will know how to attack Klingon. Against Baycott and against PJ Hall, you saw some double teams, and you saw, selective double teams at least. Against UConn or against UNC, there were quite a few more double teams just due to the fact that there were some guys that were not shooters on the floor. I do not expect that you will see too many just straight up double teams against UConn. The shooters are a good bit better that UConn has. They have 3 guys that have taken over 200 threes this season in Tristan Newton, Cam Spencer, and Alex Caravan. Cam Spencer, by far the best shooter of the group, shooting about 44%. Caravan's at 38%. Tristan Newton's at 32%. So they have some shooters. So I do not expect that Alabama is going to truly just sag off a shooter and double, worrying about Donovan Klingon. However, watching how Alabama defends Klingon and how Alabama defends this team will be something to watch in this game. However, in my mind, this game is going to come down to, as much as that, how can Alabama finish at the rim? In the beginning of that Clemson game, Alabama did a horrible job finishing at the rim. A large part of that was just due to us missing shots. I'm not going to say PJ Hall was not affecting those shots, but a large part was us just missing shots. Alabama will have to make shots over Klingon, and we'll have to make some tough twos in this game. They're not going to come easy, and they're not going to be, just put them up. But Alabama will have to make some tough twos. How Alabama attacks the rim and, do we get him into pick and rolls? How do we attack Klingon is going to be a key to this game. Because Illinois went right at Klingon, and it was a block party. When Klingon was on the floor, that's how Illinois ends up giving up a 30-0 run to UConn and just really couldn't score. Illinois missed a ton of shots. They, don't even cross 30% on the game. They're under 30% from 3 as well. So, they missed a ton of shots. But a large piece to do with that was they were trying to shoot over Klingon. And whether he affects the shot by blocking it or just affects the trajectory of the shot, he does a great job of that. So as I mentioned, it will be important. Alabama has played bigs, like I said, in Kalkbrenner and Edey, that are very, very similar in the way that they guard the rim. So, we have experience with it, but they're going to have to play one of the best games of the season. You're going to need big games out of Sears, out of Estrada, out of Ryland, finishing at the rim, as well as your big guys finishing at the rim. The other thing about this game is UConn plays a good bit slower. UConn only has 2 games this season against high major opponents over 70 possessions. They had 72 possessions against Xavier and 71 possessions against Carolina. They end up winning both of those games, but UConn has not faced a team like Alabama that will like to run quite at the level we do. Alabama, in my opinion, will have the most success if they can get a shot early in the shot clock, because the defense will not be set, Klingon will not be fully in position, and that is where the shots, more than likely in this game, will need to come for Alabama to have the most efficient shot. And then they're going to have to sit down and defend for the whole shot clock. UConn is a very slow offense. They average 18.5 seconds per possession on offense, which is around 300th in the country nationally. This is a team that runs a more methodical offense, does not run a very fast offense, but they are very efficient doing it. As I mentioned, they're They're 7th in effective field goal percentage to go with currently the number 1 offense in the country. We do know, however, as I mentioned, if Latrell Wrightsell does play in this game, Alabama with Latrell Wrightsell can be the number 1 offense in the country. Currently, UConn is a 126.6. Alabama got up to a 127, almost a 128. So Alabama is capable of performing much better than UConn currently is when they have Wrightsell. The question is, will they put it all together? In my opinion, one of the spots where Alabama has a chance to really be successful in this game is if they can hit shots. Obviously the 3-point shot is the X factor in many games. UConn typically does a very good job running you off the line, though. Last season, it was a different roster for UConn, but last season UConn played Alabama, and UConn only allowed Alabama to get up 16 3-point attempts. And it was a game where UConn made it a goal to run Alabama off the 3-point line. My assumption is going to be that will be much of their goal in this game. If we can look back at what happened in that game against UConn last season, obviously much different players on both teams. Donovan Clingan did play last season, but he only played 11 minutes. Caravan played big minutes in that game. Tristan Newton played big minutes in that game. But a large percentage of the people in that game are now different. UConn tried to turn over Alabama. They end up getting 21 turnovers. And UConn, they block 7 shots. And they win the offensive rebounding battle. They get more assists. And they ran us off the line. This is a more efficient offense than last year's team. However, UConn has played an Alabama offense. They have played the Nate Oates offense. For those of you unaware, Dan Hurley and Nate Oates are friends. They know each other quite well. Dan Hurley actually is the reason why Nate Oates is in college coaching. There was a player, E.C. Matthews, that was being recruited by Rhode Island when Dan Hurley was in Rhode Island. And he became friends with Nate Oates in the recruitment of E.C. Matthews. Then when Bobby Hurley was at Buffalo and was looking for an assistant coach, Danny, connected Nate with Bobby. Bobby ends up hiring Nate to be an assistant at Buffalo, which then turns into the head coaching job at Buffalo. And now Nate's where he is today. Also, Danny and Bobby both were high school coaches. And obviously with Nate Oates having been a high school coach as well, they have an utmost respect for each other and they do know each other very well. So this is not a game plan where these coaches don't know anything about each other's styles, don't know anything about how each other likes to defend or play the game. There is a decent amount of familiarity in this game. So that's why I look back at last season's game, because that is one of the first games. I believe that was the first time that Danny had ever played against Nate. So very important to note, like I said, how that worked. I would expect that UConn is going to try to run Alabama off the 3-point line, especially with them having Clingan down low, being able to protect the rim. How Alabama is able to defend in this game, how Alabama is able to shoot in this game, very much will tell you how Alabama is going to play this game. In my opinion, this is not a game where Alabama can stand to get down 13 points. They got down big against Clemson. They got down pretty decent against Carolina. If Alabama gets down that level like they did in those prior 2 games, in my opinion, it's going to be a tough sled for Alabama to come back. However, if Alabama plays what got them here, they run their sets, they trust in their scouts, they trust in the system that Nate Oates runs, and they make some shots and play free-flowing offense, they have a chance of winning this game. And I have some faith that they will play free. Like I said, they were a little tight in that Clemson game, but I do think that Alabama will play free, knowing that it's the Final Four. And UConn has everything to lose. They're trying to defend as the national champs. They are going to be an 11.5 or more point favorite in this game. Like 98% of the money line is on UConn. UConn is the prohibitive favorite in this game. Alabama has nothing to lose and absolutely everything to gain. And Alabama is just going to play with a chip on their shoulder. So if they can play their offense and lock into their scouting report, I think Alabama has a shot of winning this game. They just have to play the Alabama brand of basketball that got them where they're at today. So that's my breakdown of the UConn game. As I mentioned, if Alabama does win this game, I will probably be breaking down the national championship game on Sunday. Will be a little bit shorter episode. I'm not sure how that's going to happen with it being recorded in Phoenix from the hotel, but I'm happy to try to put together whatever information I can. As always, I will be putting out a thread going through each player on UConn's team as well as an official score prediction the day before the game. I probably will write it probably here coming up soon, and then we'll release it on Friday before the game. And then I will be in Phoenix, as I mentioned, flight out of Birmingham on Friday, getting into Phoenix Friday night ahead of the game on Saturday. So if anybody is in Phoenix and is interested in getting drinks or, hanging out, let me know. I'm happy to hang out with Alabama fans. But thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.